Hi everyone, this is 4.1 Washington's Presidency. The objective for today is that by the end of the lesson, you will be able to explain how George Washington transformed the ideas of the new Constitution into a government. On the left-hand side of your notebook, this is what you should have written down: New Government, Washington's Additions, the Two-Party System, Whiskey Rebellion, Foreign Affairs, and John Adams. The new government, how Washington added and made it his own. With the judicial branch, he expanded the sites and scopes of the judicial branch by the Judiciary Act of 1789, which established a full-on court system. So in addition to a Supreme Court, there was also a set of circuit courts and district courts throughout the country. And this allowed decisions to be made in state court. And this also allowed decisions that were made in state court to be appealed to a federal court if they were dealing with constitutional issues. This is important because the Judiciary Act of 1789 ensured that the federal law was still the supreme law of the land. For his executive branch, he set up a cabinet, and a cabinet is essentially the advisory board. It's something that is still in existence today. And these are people that are experts in the fields that they are representing. Some of his known cabinet members were Thomas Jefferson, who was in charge of Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton, who was the Secretary of Treasury, and Henry Knox, who was our Secretary of War. In addition to that, our Attorney General was Edmund Randolph. During Washington's presidency, we also started to see the two-party system develop. You may know the two-party system today as Democrats and Republicans, but during Washington's time, it was the Federalist and the Democratic Republicans. Hamilton was a member of the Federalist Party. He also supported the National Bank, and he wanted to see the South help pay the debts of the Revolutionary War. Since the South had a lot of money coming in, a lot of the war debts were suffered in the North. He wanted to see the South help pay for that. Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. Being from the South, he wasn't necessarily in support of the South having to pay for the debts of the Revolutionary War. And he believed in more of an agrarian society, small farmers, not this big national government, kind of this small, people handle their own business type of a system. These two parties split from Washington's cabinet. And part of the split happened, but even though they split from the cabinet, they were still able to come up with a compromise, and that was the nation's capital. And what they decided to do was take land from Maryland and Virginia to establish the nation's capital. Since the nation's capital would then be in the South would then be willing to help support the National Bank and help pay back some of the debts for the Revolutionary War. Now, Virginia ended up taking its land back from the nation's capital, and we'll discuss that later on during the year. But originally, the Washington, D.C. was a perfect diamond. Part of that perfect diamond came from Maryland, and the other half came from Virginia. Just to kind of go over, this is kind of an interesting thing about the differences between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. Now, again, remember, Jefferson was a Democratic Republic, and Hamilton was a Federalist. The Federalists we tend to see a little bit more traditional, a little bit more stiff, if you would. They tended to wear their hair back with either a wig or powdered their hair. They had a bow tie on. They had much more tailored look as far as the pants and the coat goes. Whereas then you had the Democratic Republicans that were a little bit more loose hair. They had a handkerchief around their neck instead of a bow tie. Their pants were a little bit more wide-legged. And this was more of a French style versus more of a British style, which makes sense because Jefferson spent a lot of time in France. The Whiskey Rebellion. So whiskey was an important good in parts of the country. But the government decided to put an excise tax on whiskey, and an excise tax means an extra tax. So it was in addition to whatever other taxes were added on there. You may be familiar with excise tax on things like soda or, cigarettes. Alcohol has excise tax. This extra tax on whiskey caused a rebellion to ensue. People were upset about the tax, so they rebelled about it. The federal government was able to stop the rebellion without any loss of life, and the reason why this is so important is because it's the first time we saw the federal government use its powers, sending the National Guard, or sending military in domestic affairs. Foreign affairs. Neutrality and gaining territory. I realize that these two things are not red and underlined, but you should probably still have them written down in your notebook. So neutrality and gaining territory. Neutrality in the French Revolution. The U.S. decided to stay out of the French Revolution. When the French was trying to break away from their current form of government, the United States said they didn't want to be involved. In addition to that, we also expanded our territory. Thomas Pinckney worked with Spain and set up boundaries between the United States and Spain, but part of this compromise also allowed the U.S. to use the port of New Orleans, which was extremely important because being able to do that allowed us to trade into the Gulf of Mexico, which opened up trade for the United States, and then move goods from the Gulf of Mexico up the Mississippi River into the inner parts of the country. Jay Treaty was also negotiated during the presidency, and this is where the British agreed to leave the Northwest Territory. So as you can see in this right here, there were a couple of forts that were in the Northwest Territory, and some of these were controlled by Great Britain. And so Great Britain decided to go ahead and leave these forts and allow, and leave the forts and leave that part of the country. And so this allowed the colonists or the United States to move further westward because they no longer controlled these forts. And this promoted westward expansion. In 1796, Washington decided not to run for re-election, and John Adams became a president. John Adams was a Federalist. Jefferson was a Democratic Republic. We don't see this today. We don't see two people from different parties being president and vice president. What used to happen was the person that won the most votes became president, and the second most votes became vice president. That's going to change in the next election. We'll see that, and we'll talk about that then. What we also started to see happening in 1796 was this idea of sectionalism or sectionalist. And this is where we started to have an interest in one region of the country over that of the entire country. Adams' presidency had some contentious relationships. First was the XYZ affair. So there was a lot of tensions between the United States and France. The United States sent over individuals to meet with French government and French officials. When they got there, France demanded $250,000 bribe in order for any U.S. officials to meet with any French officials. This obviously did not go over well in the United States, and the United States was upset about it, and eventually led to a 2-year naval war between the United States and France. So we never actually went to full-on war with them, but we did have a naval disagreements between the two countries. The Alien and Sedition Acts also happened under Adams' presidency, and this made it more difficult for people to become a citizen. But in addition to that, it also punished anyone who went against the government. And so this was very controversial when it comes to freedom of speech, especially freedom of press, the idea that you could be punished if you did that. And so this idea of nullification came up, and nullification is when states nullify any act of Congress that they deem to be unconstitutional. We saw this happening in Virginia and Kentucky after the Sedition Act. They declared that this was unconstitutional, and therefore they did not need to follow it. And that is it for today's lesson.